Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to session 6 of the Gibbon Caribbean Youth Diplomacy Development course. I'm Antia Atkinson. Most of you would know me by now. I'm one of the co-coordinators and steering committee members of the Gibbon Caribbean Network. This evening, we have with us Miss Jillian Gollard, and she's the founder of the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective, more popularly known as the Chocolate Rebellion, and the Alliance of Rural Communities, ARC, which are movements committed to sustainable food production with a specific focus on the chocolate industry. Through the Chocolate Rebellion and ARC, Gillian has led efforts across the Caribbean, Africa, and North America to build grassroots agricultural collectives, create community marketplaces, promote regenerative farming systems, and support sustainable rural livelihoods. Gillian also provides support to Black food sovereignty projects in East Cleveland, Memphis, and Chicago. Ultimately, her work has resulted in thousands of farmers and chocolate makers being trained in over 20 countries across the world. She served as a visiting lecturer at multiple universities globally, and her achievements include receiving the IICA's Soul of Rurality Award for enhancing rural communities, protecting biodiversity, and improving food security. In this evening's session, Gillian will deliver a presentation on the importance of grassroots movements and how to build an effective grassroots movement. Because while we know that participating in international conferences is important, we also need to recognize that strong grassroots movements and local actions are needed to turn that talk into action on the ground. Before we officially start, I just want to remind you guys of the rules of our session. You will not be able to unmute unless prompted. If you do need to speak, then we will unmute you manually. If you do need to chat, then you can use the Q&A box. The Q&A box will be at the top or bottom of your screen, so you can take a few seconds to get familiar with the device you're on and locate that Q&A box. Fear not, you will be able to interrupt once prompted and said we will unmute you if necessary. And now over to you, Jillian. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we are in similar time zones. I am dialing in from Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm actually in Tunapuna. I'm not sure if there are other people on the call who are close to me, but if you are, you can say hi. I was born and grew up in Trinidad and moved to the US for college. Ended up staying there, but I was up and down a lot. Back into Trinidad, I worked for a period in Barbados. And I would say that one of the hopeful things I like to convey to people who are younger than me is that you can reinvent yourself at various times in your life. And I'm one of those people. I was in science in my 20s and then realized where the limitations of the applied science that I wanted to do were. And so my work moved more and more into activism. And so what I want to do for the next 10, 15 minutes is go through a bit an organization and some connected organizations that I've worked with hundreds of others to establish over the last 11 years. And part of what I would like to leave with you all and that I would like us to discuss some more is how can you create rapid impact with few financial resources? And so I'm going to put on my slides and talk a little bit about what this is that we have created over the last 11 years, really. So let me just put it in slideshow mode. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of a well-being economy. In a lot of ways, we've been programmed to speak about things in financial terms, GDPs, GNP, salaries, and so on. But in the end, as many of us know who've been in oil economies, dollars don't necessarily make for quality of life. You definitely need a certain amount of dollars to have a certain quality of life. But above that, how does that look? So what I want to say is that in our case, we consider that everything we are doing, whether it's selling chocolates, turning five fingers into jam, whether it's running a cafe, trying to find ways to move goods around, we are thinking about a well-being economy. And I'm going to just read through what I have on the screen. It's usually considered to be a public policy framework, but in our case, it's also an organization and philosophy in which the economy is designed to serve social, health, cultural, equity, and nature outcomes. This seems kind of like self-explanatory. It's like, why do I have to explain this? Well, because we don't often sit down and think about how is the money serving these outcomes. We will often divorce the outcomes from the earning of the money. And so I want to make sure that we understand as we go through the organizations that I'm engaged in, that this is what we're trying to do, improve people's quality of life, which means you have to think about what is it that you're trying to achieve. So these are the three organizations that now form a kind of network. The first one started in Trinidad, and it's called the Alliance of Rural Communities. And since the beginning in Trinidad, it's spread to other Caribbean places, particularly in the area of cocoa and chocolate, where our main goal around cocoa and chocolate is to ensure that the farmers who are planting cocoa and chocolate, particularly farming communities, not focusing on wealthy large farm owners, cocoa communities get to benefit from the cocoa that they have. And one of our strategies is to get people to take the cocoa and turn it into chocolate. We'll come back to that. On the far right is the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective. And that really came about during COVID. During COVID, we had already done about 6 years of work within the Alliance of Rural Communities in 4 communities in Trinidad, 2 communities in St. Lucia, 1 engagement in Guyana. And we had started work in Dominica also. And then there was a hurricane that came through and it paused the work because the cocoa trees got damaged. And so we had set up already templates and systems of working. And that's another idea that I want us to come back to. So during COVID, our tourism arm of the Alliance of Rural Communities was pretty much smashed into the ground. Trinidad and Tobago closed our borders for the period of intense COVID. And so we were making about 30% of our revenue from tourism and most of our profit because everything else was pretty much break even. And so, but through a lot of coincidences and social media, which I really value the useful things that social media can bring into our lives, I reached out to a cocoa farmer in Malawi and some others in Uganda. And then eventually we started networking, and within a few weeks, we had a Pan-African chocolate chain starting to form online. So we had people from African countries and from African diaspora countries, including the Caribbean groups in Alliance of Rural Communities, which are not all African diaspora, but have some of the subsets, and also African American communities in the US on a screen in a call. So Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective is now 3.5 going on 4 years old, and it's actually there's activity in about 20 countries now. In the middle of all of that, the Sale Culture Collective was being born. During the early years of the Alliance of Rural Communities, we began to consider how we're moving things around. And because we think of the well-being economy, which includes environmental equity, it means that we had to think about how we're transporting goods from one place to the next. And so we began experimenting with sailboats, and we actually did a trip where we sailed cocoa butter, coconut oil, and cocoa powder from Trinidad to Barbados because Barbados doesn't have a high concentration of cocoa trees. And so we began more deeply exploring the idea of moving things from place to place using sails. What is the motto that we started with? Centering the periphery. We believe that the places in the world that produce raw materials have been put on the periphery, and we want to recenter them because without those raw materials, none of the processed goods, none of the cities, nothing in the global north could operate the way that it does today. So these are the 3 overlapping collectives, and they are made up of collectives. So I'm going to go through a little bit the timeline of the Alliance of Rural Communities. So in 2015, we started the trainings for people to make chocolate from their cacao beans. We actually didn't intend to form an NGO. We were just, a few of us were just volunteering and helping people to make chocolate. But we had been asked by Marshall Montano to make chocolate for an event that he was doing for his big Marshall Monday concert. And so when we started doing these trainings, we asked the Montanos if they could sponsor the equipment for a couple of the early communities. And they were willing, they got equipment. But of course, it was really difficult for the press to separate what we were doing with Marshall. And so at that point, we began to form a body, so nothing to do with Marshall or anything, but to do with having to differentiate that we were actually doing the training. This was not a government thing. This was a group of citizens who got together and decided, with the support of the Marshall Montano Foundation for Greatness, which bought some of the equipment, that we would start getting cocoa communities to make chocolate. Soon after, we realized that we needed to have each village community make its own company. In a sense, you could say that what we were developing was a franchise network, except in most franchises, the parent company gets all the money, gets commission, and so on. And in this case, that's not what was happening. We were co-branding, we were cooperating, but we weren't using the extractive systems of a franchise. We realized very quickly also that within the making of chocolate, there was the concept of how do we share this chocolate making? How do we share these fields with people and keep a healthy ecosystem? And so we quickly began doing tourism activities. So that was happening in the Northern Range in Trinidad mainly, but also we ended up in a community in the northeast of Trinidad where for 4 months of the year, the economy is highly focused on leatherback turtles. The rest of the year, it was really hard for people to make income. And so bringing in chocolates and chocolate tourism allowed the tourism market to go on through the rest of the year. While we were doing this, since most of us were environmentalists, foresters, birders, farmers with using organic techniques, we decided we wanted to put a stamp of environmental protection a bit more heavily as a cross-cutting principle within our networks. And so we formed an NGO. We started off with the name Arc Conservation, but we're now in the process of changing it to Arc Environmental, partially because of some of the undertones of colonialism that come with the word conservation. That's a whole other discussion, but it would be nice to have it at some point. So by this point, we had an initial NGO. The community chocolate companies were LLCs, so they were LTD companies. The conservation organization is an NGO, but we realized that in most communities in which we were operating, there wasn't the ability for the communities to transport their goods to stores, to get inside of the larger stores. And so once again, we came together and we formed another collective. And so one branch of the organization is called Arc Enterprises, and we have a vehicle, we have someone who works for that. And so we collect the chocolates from all the different companies, we deliver them together, we make flavors that are complementary. We know that the competition is not something we have to engage in. We can engage in collaboration and all of us will thrive. So a lot of things we buy together, we buy parts for machines, we buy labels, we buy wrappers, we buy sugar, and we also transport goods to the market together. So this was the initial start of the organization. And then we went one step further. Prior to making the chocolate, several of us had been farmers and we used to sell various products. And so we took our farming enterprises and we merged them together and we created a space called Arc Marketplace. That space was put together partially because in order to create a polyculture food forest with cocoa as the anchor crop, And to not move in the direction of a homogeneous monoculture, we needed to also find ways for people to get value from other crops. And so we began putting together first a basket of produce, and then over time we began to either process some of those other crops, or we began to support people in the communities to sell their processed crops. And at this point, we have about 200 products in our marketplace. And that is really what kept us going during COVID. In addition, once these groups had been formed, we decided to expand into other products. And so we got some woodworking equipment for the Grand Revere group. We got some bottle bead making equipment for another group. We began to do catering items. Some of those projects have worked and others have not. And so we've learned a lot through it about the way in which a group can diversify. And I would say that the final piece for this journey is where I'm sitting today, which is a cafe activist space, third space, in which not only do we sell the products from the network, so we sell coffee that's local coffee, we sell provision pies, we sell pastels, we sell a bunch of things that are made in the communities, but we also realized in our journey that even if we were doing this really radical thing, that the national framework didn't necessarily catch up with it. And we wanted to support other change makers to get on board with what we were doing. And so now we have this space. Last year, we did over 100 events. We have feminist events. We have events for youth activists. We have LGBTQ plus events. We have events for agricultural processors to discuss herbs, local cooking, recipe development, a lot of different things, as you can see on the slide. So that is the network, and this is what we've ended up with now. We've ended up with what we call a forest. And so one of the aspects of thought that we use in our process of development is we examine the way a forest develops after it has been damaged. What happens? How does biodiversity return to this forest? And in a sense, that's what we use as the principles of our business strategy. I know it may sound a little strange. We don't really have time to go into it in great detail, but maybe you can ask some questions about it. So as you see, we've ended up with a really resilient network. So as I said, during COVID, all our tourism came to an end. That's the lower left, you'll see our destinations. That closed down completely. And so we were able to go to the middle right, where you see ARC Marketplace. We were one of the first and only groups delivering food when the borders were closed and people weren't able to go to supermarkets freely. And so people started ordering from us at a large level. We ended up expanding goods we had, buying more things to be able to sell a complete basket to people so that they can get natural cleaning products, and we don't use single-use plastic because why cause another problem in the process of solving a problem? So this is what that network looked like. But I'm going to jump now to the global network, which is the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective. And this is a network that we utilize the templates of ARC, but we are still in the process of using mainly one product to build this out because this is in a lot of other countries. So we have one group, which we call the Mothership, which is made up of a fluid movement of people thinking about the structure of these groups, the challenges and the strengths. We have a producer hive, which is based in Caribbean countries and African countries, and we have one group in Colombia. And this is the group that takes cocoa beans. 75% of the world's cocoa beans are either grown in Africa or by the African diaspora in the Caribbean and Latin America. So we have a producer hive and we were able to mobilize lots of resources, get machines, teach people on Zoom. I'm very good friends with a lot of the people in the network and I've literally never met them in 3D. The goal was to take the products from the producer hive, make chocolate paste, cocoa butter, cocoa powder, and send it to the chocolate hive, which would be located mainly in the global north, where cocoa is not grown, but also in countries in the global south where cocoa isn't grown. So in the Caribbean, that means like Nevis has some cocoa, but it doesn't have the same amount. So we have sent things there. Barbados, the same position. Antigua, generally cocoa grows in a place with high humidity and high rainfall. And the goal was also to do that transport by sail ship. So in a more detailed fashion, this is what the producer hive looks like. I started off working with a whole group, but then I decided I was going to focus on the collectives in the group. And so my work for the last year has been mainly with a cooperative in Côte d'Ivoire with 400 farmers, a collection of cooperatives in Cameroon with 2,000 farmers, a all-women's cooperative in Ghana with 1,006 women, two collectives in St. Lucia, if there are any St. Lucians on this call. One is in Micoud and one is in Beausoleil, and the collectives in Trinidad and Tobago. In the other countries, most of the people were individual entrepreneurs, and that's a very different community. And so my focus tends to be on collectives. In the global north, where we first started was meeting groups in African American inner cities who would be welcoming the introduction of a chocolate to what they were doing. So we started off in East Cleveland, which is just east of Cleveland, as it says, and it's a Black community that's one of the financially most impoverished communities in the US. They had a community group there already. We put some equipment and taught them how to take that chocolate that was already made in the global south and turn it into other products, how to do tastings, tours, etc. We did the same in Chicago. Chicago didn't actually have a topic group. They were forming cooperatives in the same neighborhood that Martin Luther King had lived briefly in Chicago. And they were looking for content for the cooperatives, and someone introduced us to them, and they now have a chocolate cooperative. They actually are about to form two. Memphis was slightly different in that it was a Pan-African coffee supply chain, but they needed to find ways to source the chocolates they used in their mochas and their desserts and so on. So these were the three groups we worked with the most over the last 2.5 years, but now we're in the process of forming a cooperative in New York City, and it's going to be housed inside of a Black agricultural, what's called a CSA box scheme, where they buy products from Black, Indigenous women, non-binary farmers throughout the state of New York, and they sell it to customers in the Bed-Stuy area. We've also done some outreach in London, Paris, Rotterdam. What's not listed here is Berlin and Copenhagen. So we've had events in those cities. We are branded as Chocolate Rebellion, but that in itself is really interesting because for cultural reasons, it's not a collection of words we can use in Côte d'Ivoire or Cameroon. And yet in Paris, the group there preferred to use the term Chocolate Rebellion than Révolution du Chocolat or Rebellion du Chocolat. In 2024, one of the things we did to move people towards forming cafes was we did a pop-up in 11 countries in 14 locations. So we were in Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, also in Trinidad and Tobago, Nevis, and St. Lucia. We were in a town with an Afro-Indigenous group in Colombia, in Memphis, Cleveland, London, Paris, Copenhagen. And through that, the Cameroon group has now set up a restaurant with a chocolate shop included. We are working on getting some funding for the Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire group. And so there was a lot that came out of this in introducing people to using their chocolate in a more retail fashion. So there's a picture of some of the people in our group. I'll just go from left to right. Trinidad, Côte d'Ivoire, Malawi, Uganda, Trinidad, Honduras, but in California, Dominica, Jamaica, Grenada, Trinidad, Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, Trinidad, US and Washington, D.C., Ghana, Cameroon, Zambia, Trinidad. So this poster includes some of the people in the produce and processing side, non-chocolate side, and some of the people in chocolate in Trinidad and Tobago, which really is where, even though the numbers are not largest, it's really where a lot of the prototyping is happening. So this is giving you an overview. I have lots more slides if you have questions. I have lots of things that I would love to chat about and to give you all a moment to digest this. We have done, so I'm going to stop sharing now. We have done an analysis of return on investment because one of the things that we have been quite frustrated by is what happens when money gets out into the public space in the Caribbean. And so what we can say for ourselves is that for every dollar that has been put in, it has resulted in $10 in retail revenue. And our revenue streams are very diverse. And now we've reached a point where we are being asked to do consulting because we have been able to do this supply chain with very little money, relying on resources of all kinds, including relationship, and working on prototyping things that are relevant for our specific environments, which includes that we are in villages of 250. And then we are also in Tunapuna, which is a confluence town with thousands in it. So, in a sense, that's a bit of a synopsis. In terms of the sail cargo, I have a whole other slide presentation on that because one of the areas of trade that is probably the most heavily colonized is transport. Even if we produce local goods, we are still moving them around from island to island and from the region to other regions in ships that are owned in large part by global North companies and that we have very little say in. And you really saw the crisis happen during COVID when it was difficult for us to move goods around. So I just wanted to give you all a little bit of a background, and maybe it can give you some level of understanding as how can people get together, work together to create projects without waiting for anyone to initiate them. And hopefully that gives you a little bit more of a sense as to one of the examples of how that has happened. So I would really like to go to if there are questions, comments, thoughts, what jumped out at you. I mean, we're in an online space. Usually I'm the type of presenter that likes to go around and get impressions from people. So please feel free to drop stuff in the questions in the chat and we can kind of come back to some of the details. So thank you for your attention so far. Okay, I'm going into the questions. You mentioned forming organizations and doing advocacy work with low financial resources. Could you go into this a bit more detail in a way that we can replicate? Okay, well, I'm going to answer that without typing it. So this is the idea of action with low financial resources is one that I think there's a lot of experience with that in the Caribbean. We see it often at the end of a disaster, for example, when there's a hurricane that passes through, or an earthquake, or a volcano, we see people able to move forward, consolidate, and create expanded and amplified action before the money flows in from agencies. It is a type of behavior that we struggle sometimes to mobilize around when there isn't a major disaster. I would say that the Caribbean is a society that has been built around collective action. For hundreds of years, most of the citizens did not have access to the financial resources that were being developed in the area, but yet we were able to develop very dramatically delicious cuisines, dances, songs, art forms, business ideas. We produced people who created innovation in pretty much any area you can find. Caribbean people are somewhere. And I would even dare to say that the way that the Caribbean works is kind of like an innovation laboratory. Because our populations are small, because they do not have a lot of historic rules of the way it is supposed to be. I know that it doesn't feel that way, but our rules of cultural compartmentalization are only 100 or 200 years and sometimes less. There are societies that have these rules for thousands of years. So it allows us to have a space where we can have a lot of imagination happening. And in general, what I have tended to find is that imagination trumps resource in terms of material resource. But what I can say is that our skills in collective action have gotten worse in my lifetime. It's a kind of problematic situation where you shouldn't have to be low in resource to know how to collaborate with each other. So what we need to be figuring out is how can we increase resource as we have over the last 100 years, and yet not lose our generosity, our cultural competence in collective action. Because with collective action, you can pool resources in a way that allows you to do a lot with very little. And if I were to describe to you the daily life of a lot of us inside of our, pretty much the initial group, we were all very collaborative. And by collaborating and people seeing the results of it and working in rural space, because in rural space, in Trinidad and Tobago, well, particularly in Trinidad, we have a strong Afro-Indigenous communities in cocoa areas. We actually even have a term for it, cocoa payols. And in those communities, historically, there's been a high level of collaboration, which has even been guided by how cocoa grows. Because cocoa is a type of crop, when it comes into harvest time, everything is ripening at the same time. And so you need to actually deal with it collectively. And so in those communities, it's only very recently that people have started behaving in much more individualistic ways. And in my exploration throughout the Caribbean, plus the fact that I am descended from Vincentians and Bajans, so like a typical Trinidadian, I have a lot of the rest of the Caribbean in my blood and culture. I saw people cooperating a lot. And I would say that my ancestors have given me a model of how you get things done with very little money. And taking that from our personal and social lives into our economic lives, there weren't boundaries between those things. We have now taken on some behaviors from cultures that are not necessarily similar to ours, and it's causing some issues because our collective literacy is not getting better. And so in our groups, we work a lot on that. We work a lot on emotional literacy, conflict resolution. We have a talk coming up next week on reciprocity, which lack of reciprocity or perceived lack of reciprocity is one of the things that makes people feel that they don't want to keep working in groups. So my long answer to almost every question, I always tell people I have a one-word answer: together. But then how do you work together? How do you work collectively if you have been through an educational system that rewards individual action? That a lot of the projects are set up where you have to work by yourself. Otherwise, it's considered even cheating, right? So I would say that getting skilled in collective action, improving emotional literacy, and getting to improve your skills in conflict resolution are some of the most important things to allow you to bring those things as resources to the table instead of having to have large sums of money. The other thing is, I don't tend to work in NGO projects that do not have an income earning arm. What I have found is that if you are dependent on the grant system with the ups and downs, it's not saying you shouldn't take some grants, but you have to figure out how you can also work with the fact that there's a lot of unpredictability in the economic system right now, including philanthropy. And so you have to find ways. We are extremely talented, and there are many niches that are not filled. And so how can we sit not necessarily to turn our NGOs or CSOs into businesses, but how can we figure out some ways for us to make money ourselves? So I hope that that kind of answers some of the question that you asked about. I mean, obviously, this is a short period of time, so we can't answer it all, but at least those hints will hopefully be helpful in your thinking about what are some resources that can make the need for the resource of money less important.
Good
And
evening.
yeah,
Hi, I had a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. Um, I wanted to know, what should policymakers understand about the connection between trade policies, agricultural development, as well as biodiversity protection?
okay, I'm just trying to put those points. So there's trade policy, biodiversity protection, and what was the third thing you said?
And agricultural development.
Okay, let me just, it's getting a little dark here, so I'm just gonna try and brighten up my screen a bit. So let's see, there we go. Okay, that's a little better. Okay. That's a big question. So I think first let's address the idea of policy, right? I would say that in the majority of Caribbean people, including myself for much of my life, and even sometimes in little segments, the relationship of policy to our everyday lives is very much a mystery. I would also say that in my experience, the implementation of decisions made on a governmental level or on an international policy level, if they cannot be implemented and they cannot be enforced, it gets really difficult to justify even putting the policy into place. And so in the areas that I am working in, and that intersect with what you're asking about, including biodiversity, protection of the environment, what I call human supremacy, and the things that fall under it, I have found that cultural behavior around those areas can be as powerful, if not more powerful, than policy. That having a population that feels connected to the things that surround them, the non-human forms of life, can often be a much more rapid way to protect these other forms of life than something that happens inside of a boardroom or inside of a conference. My paternal lineage is from Tobago, and I grew up around fishermen. My cousins, a whole branch of them, they are fishermen. And I grew up seeing them using restraint in how they fished from the sea. And there were a lot of fish around. Now we're in a position where they have to go really, really far from Tobago shoreline to catch fish. So their lives are in a lot more danger. I mean, they're immediately facing the effects of the fact that there is bottom trawling, that for whatever reason, the larger plane of decision making doesn't seem to be working in their favor. And so that's one reason that I chose to take direct action. And I think that in our case, the direct action can actually lead to policy and the possibility of implementation of policy, including the protection of forests. We have data now that shows that if a collective in a community works in a certain way with this integrated environmental group, polyculture food forest with trees that are not that are perennials and so on, that we can actually protect the forest around and livelihoods can come from it. And so it's not a policy, if a policy comes out of that, it's not divorced from evidence that there are enough things in place in this particular way of setting things up that the policy will be able to be implemented. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I tend to be on the more pessimistic side of policy divorced from cultural engagement. And that doesn't mean that you have to just take the way the culture is functioning now. Our cultures are cultures that have been through massive trauma. I mean, all cultures across the globe. And so there are ways that we can set goals of how we want our culture to function, including increased biodiversity. And I don't think that that is separate from the work that we can do to provide for the things that we need, which we call supply chains, in a way that also fulfills our needs for biodiversity. Can the policy follow those conclusions? I would say that on that side, I can be a little pessimistic. So and I don't think I can generalize because I have seen policy that works effectively in some subset areas, but I've also seen policy that basically, because it didn't follow the mandate of high income corporate space, was not able to be implemented. So thank you for your question. I'm not sure if I answered it, but hopefully I shared with you some of my perspective on the relationship between these things and the places that I feel optimistic, which is community action with data being fed back in, as opposed to policy that is developed with a subset of people based on class, gender, whatever, and that has no relationship to what is applicable and enforceable in a community. Anthea, I'm not sure exactly how you would like me to, if you want me to prioritize the questions in the question and answer area, if you want me to prioritize questions that people are asking directly, maybe you could give me a little bit of a hint as to what might make sense.
Hi, Jillian. We can go ahead and have Julie ask her question, and then you can head back into the Q&A.
Okay, sounds good.
Hi, good evening. Am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Right. So for starters, I wanted to say I love the presentation so much. I'm very passionate about chocolate. I love chocolate, and I've always been struggling with how to consume chocolate, knowing the ethical problems surrounding it. And so I have a twofold question. One is kind of surrounded with that. I know there's a lot of issues as it comes to greenwashing with companies where they kind of um, limit how their impact and how the people on the ground that are producing the crops are impacted and how they're actually being treated. So I know that that's a major issue, and I was wondering, how were you able to keep things fair throughout the collective? How were you able to ensure livable incomes for farmers and sellers and keeping things fair across board where other companies have failed? And then secondly towards that, would you refer to your collective as socialist? Is that a term that you would use? And if so, would you recommend non-capitalist business practices? And if yes, how do you frame that in a world where things like capitalism and socialism and communism are such polarizing topics right now?
Okay, well, okay, so the quicker answer is the end. I don't use so basically from the work that I've done over the years in my life, I consider all industrial processes at large scale to be damaging to the environment and biodiversity, whether they are capitalist, communist, socialist, whatever. I have been in countries that practiced all of those different tools. And I would say that thinking that one of them has the magic answers to the world from 2026 on can be a little tricky. I have a made-up term that I use that I call myself an indigenist. I would say that's my political belief system, which is land-based, with land and the requirements of land as a beautiful guide to the way forward. And so that's one reason that I said earlier that we utilize an approach of imitation of natural systems, mature natural systems, such as a mature mangrove swamp or a mature polyculture forest to guide our business policy, to think about our philosophy, to deal with challenges when they appear. Because the system of living beings and even mineral life on the planet is so sophisticated and so complex and has so many answers for us. But the challenge is, if we don't speak the language, it gets very difficult to learn from it. And then we have to revert to only human-based learning, which of course is a limited subset of the learning that is possible on this planet. I'm an avid reader of science fiction and of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic books. I look at a lot of movies. I consider them almost like documentaries for me. And one of the things that again and again, I'm kind of blown away by the amazingness of this place, this planet we call Earth, and all of the ways that we can explore and live on Earth in a way that actually is pretty joyful and pretty relaxed. So politically, I don't fit my belief system or these businesses into any particular political system. We are attempting to create a way to do widespread manufacturing impact within the chocolate industry without using the typical industrial processes. Are we purists? No, because if we were purists, we would not use the machinery that we use. The stones that are being used for grinding the cocoa beans are mined from the earth, and we have not reached a point of being able to ensure that they are cooperatively owned, that there is a limit to the amount of stones that come out of the ground. But what we can control is we can diversify our product lines. We can ensure that our quality of life and our well-being economy is maximized for the amount of production that we are engaged in. One of the ways that we do this is we collect a lot of data. I think that for me, sometimes when I feel a little, well, I often feel overwhelmed, but one of the ways that I move through it emotionally is I love looking at numbers. And so we have spreadsheets that get populated, and I sometimes get up in the middle of the night and I just look to see what's happening. And for example, I was trying to pull up a spreadsheet to show you where we did our first large order to a cooperative in the United States. And we broke down all the costs involved and did an analysis of what part of that cost went to the global north versus the global south. And basically, even though we were making chocolate in the global south and sending it to the global north, the majority of the money derived from that product still went to global north countries because they own the shipping companies, they own the packaging companies. But the difference between us selling the beans and selling the chocolate was quite significant financially. But even in addition to that, we all know that farming is on the decline amongst young adults. And in several of our communities, what was clear is that people are quite happy to be known as a chocolate maker, but they didn't want to be known as a cocoa farm. And there's a good reason for that, right? Farmers are some of the lowest paid people in the world, and cocoa farmers are some of the lowest paid farmers. So converting that product into something that is a high status crop that is usually associated with sophisticated and luxury environments is exactly what I think we should be doing in the Caribbean. The product that we were supposed to produce after chocolate was perfume. And we were looking to extract essential oils from most of the perfumes are made from tropical ingredients. And one of the biggest ingredients is from Haiti. And then France is, making millions of dollars off of this product, but it doesn't slide back down to the farmer level. My experience is that I don't want to be engaged in the pricing part of things. I want to be engaged in a redesign of supply chains. And that's the way that I see that they can become not only ethical financially, but also ethical politically. Who holds the power? Who has the ability to make decisions and choices? So for those of you all who are not like chocolate engaged, the farmer income from a chocolate bar is about 6% maximum of the amount of money that is made generally in the global north from chocolate. Right now, last year, there was a drop of about 50% because of climate change. Cocoa is very susceptible to fungal diseases. So with an increase in rainfall, it means that the tree crops get affected. And the price of cocoa for the first time in history shot up. So it went from less than $2 US a kilo to over $10 US a kilo. But obviously the farmers were not making that big difference because at least not in the places that got the most challenge in rainfall, which was Cote d'Ivoire, which produces about 35% of the world's cocoa, and Ghana, which produces about 30%. And so the price shot up, and by the end of the season, the governments had negotiated with these large chocolate companies, many of whom you would never have heard the name because there's all of this background, large food conglomerates, including one called Cargill, Cargill, who sell most of the food that you consume in restaurants. They move around the raw materials. And they came to an agreement, and then this year the shortage was not as high, and so the large chocolate companies refused to pay the price that had been negotiated last year. These governmental agencies were taking a certain amount of time to renegotiate a price, and therefore this year most cocoa farmers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire were not paid or not paid on time. There was cocoa rotting at the ports on lines miles long of trucks. And so these are things that are often hidden from the public. We don't know that when we are eating food, prepared food, that the implications on a political level, we are still operating with colonial norms. And part of our action in these networks is we don't only need political independence, we need economic independence. And so that's some of what we are doing in the chocolate and cacao supply chain, but also trying to feed some of that in other supply chains within the other food sectors, but that's only happening in Trinidad. So hopefully that somewhat answers your question. And there's that saying, perfection is the enemy of good. It goes something like that. And I think that's something that we have to battle with on a daily basis. What do we accept? And having skills in talking things through as a group and being able to negotiate with each other and push back. And, we say when we don't like things, and making sure everybody is learning how to have the power to do that activation for themselves and feel some level of agency, even though, some people may have a different accent that makes them sound like if they have authority. and they may have learned in institutional spaces how to act like they know what they're doing. How do we create some agency within the group so that even on the level of cacao and other farming and processing, we are able to actually have conversations that take us in the direction of ethics? Long answer, but hopefully that gives some insight into how we are trying to make decisions.
Thank you so much, Julian. And now we have Soledad there to speak. Soledad, feel free to unmute.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning, ma'am. My name is Soledad, and I like very much your presentation. So I would like to know if it is possible for two local movements from different countries, and if they can link their effort, especially if one of them want um um want a help to export its product, because in Haiti we have so much varieties of mangoes, and there are local community that work on them, but unfortunately we export only the mango classic, not the others. But it is possible for two local movements to link their effort to help those community. And what is the mechanism? Thank you.
So Soledad, the communities you're talking about linking efforts there within Haiti. So you're looking at the possibility of creating some joint collective action with these mango producing communities so that they can sell together collectively on the local or international market. I just want to make sure that I'm clear that they are both groups within Haiti. You might need to unmute again.
You say, okay. I
The
didn't
question,
understand
the question is, and would it be better if I spoke in French? Or it doesn't matter? Je peux
No.
parler en français si tu préfères.
Yes, it
Oui,
is not a
okay.
problem.
Okay, well, my question was just to clarify, you're talking about groups within Haiti coming together to form collective action to sell the mangoes?
Yes, to export it. But unfortunately, but local community. But unfortunately, they are not a support from the government.
Right,
But
yeah.
So I think maybe with the with the help of local movement from another country, maybe it is possible. Maybe it is possible to have a cooperation between two local movements.
Yes, I agree.
To force,
Two local movements in different countries. Well,
yes,
I
from
mean,
different countries.
yeah, that's a really good question because if you look at CARICOM trade, right, and Haiti is a part of CARICOM, we are all importing close to 80% of our food and drink from outside of the region usually. And it seems sometimes inconceivable that we are not doing more trade within our borders, within our regional borders. I can't answer all of that here, but what I can say is that for us, we made a decision that we were going to collaborate with St. Lucia. And there is an organization, and I think they're in Haiti also, called ICA. And we reached out to the ICA representative to find a group in St. Lucia that we would be able to use what we had learned to transfer to them, because St. Lucia has cacao. St. Lucia has the capacity to make chocolate. St. Lucia has over 1 million visitors a year. Trinidad does not have tourism at that level. So the ability to mobilize your resource, and instead of getting, in Trinidad, when I first started making chocolate, we were selling the beans for $20 a kilo. But if you turn the beans into chocolate and you added sugar, which means that you're not even using as much of the beans, you could make, 10 times that price, right? For the end result. Of course, you had to get small machines and other things, but we had systematized all of that. So is that how it should be going? Of course. Of course, we should be talking to each other, and we should be figuring out where the gaps are in each place. And I would say that, sometimes Trinidad and Tobago is guilty of using our weight to not support in a certain way, but to negotiate, not to negotiate how we can support, but we as private citizens can make that decision. We as NGOs can make that decision. There are certain things that that Haiti has. And we were trying to do business with a few groups in Haiti at one point. And we actually have a little chocolate machine in Dominican Republic right now that is waiting to be picked up from a farmers group in Haiti for them to make chocolate. But I think where we need to move philosophically beyond where colonialism has left us, with this idea of national identity as being somehow in competition with regional identity. And we need to be doing, outside of some of the institutions that have been around for a long time, we need to be sitting as groups and analyzing the data together and talking it through and figuring out what are the next good moves for our well-being economy in the Caribbean, in the Pan-African world, in the hemisphere, whatever you want to go in terms of scale. How are we going to make sure it happens? And not sitting down, waiting for someone else to make those decisions and to get that to happen. Honestly, I find it a great pleasure to be able to solve problems that have seemed intractable for generations. I find it exciting. I'm a really bad video game player, but my children are avid game players, and so is my partner. I wish I could play video games, but instead, here I get all of these problems that I could line up and solve alongside other people. I mean, what more could I want in my life? So I think that the idea of the richness of diversity of interactions, solving problems in many diverse ways without waiting for centralized institutions, is a really exciting and interesting way to live, and takes us in the direction that I want to be going in. So yes, the answer is yes, we should be doing this. I'm just looking through some of the questions. Someone asked, what has been the largest barrier when it comes to building and maintaining relationships, given the diverse range of countries involved? That's a really interesting and exciting question. I often have people, tell me, oh, it's so difficult to get things done in the Caribbean. Oh, it's so difficult to get things done in Africa. And that has not been my experience. When it comes to citizens on the ground, farmers, and so on, it has been such a delight to work with Indigenous people, which is who most of our partners and group members in Africa are, because the code of values of care and reciprocity and so on has really taught me a lot. And so the group started in the Caribbean, and then we reached out. We did start reaching out even before Cross Atlantic in the global north, and we started trying to form relationships with Indigenous groups in the US, because the groups in Trinidad were Afro-Indigenous. As I said, they were, people learned cocoa farming from Venezuela, and communities mixed, and a lot of the communities in the Northern Range, which is where a lot of what I do exists, are Afro-Indigenous communities. And so we reached out to Indigenous communities in the US, but we didn't have anyone there to maintain the work. So one of the things we found is that when we start an initiative, there needs to be at least one person who is one of those kind of stubborn people in a community who tends to believe that things are possible and who tends to be a little bit on the optimistic side. And they will keep in touch and we will work through problems together. They often tend to be a little bit of a communicator. And so when a community has somebody like that, that often makes the work easier to do. And we were not in the US in the Indigenous communities long enough to have connected with people who matched that profile. We were just, popping in and out. When we first started the Alliance of Rural Communities, we literally would go to communities that had people we knew, and we would say, who are the people in the community who somehow organize the barbecue for the football outfits, or they're the one who, if somebody is in labor in the middle of the night, they will somehow find a way to take care of the children, or, these people who hold community together, often without compensation, without support. So when we first started, those were the people we were looking for. And we wanted to make sure that they could fit into this context of people who were pretty much generous. We always say ARC works best with people who have low personal ambition and high community ambition. And I'm not saying that, we don't care at all about our own personal lives, but we really do understand that our well-being comes from a thriving community. And when we went into the cooperative movement in Africa, in general, if somebody has joined or formed a cooperative, they already have high community ambition. Not all cooperatives, but many cooperatives. So it was kind of a no-brainer to work with people who had already formed collectives. And so I would say that where the barriers came was when we moved into cultural space where individualism and materialism had combined to create high personal ambition. And any culture where that was a very big salient factor of the culture, we had to dig a lot harder to find people who were interested in community ambition and who would be able to stay the course, because of course there are going to be obstacles. Of course you're going to feel discouraged at times. Of course we are all going to feel like we are working so hard and sometimes it's difficult to see the results. So you have to find people who have some experience of literacy with that type of behavior, that they can hang in there. Yes, we support each other, but there still has to be often, especially early in a project, the ability to hang in there as we move through these phases. And once again, you can learn that from the forest, right? After a forest is damaged by fire, you'll get these pioneer species, these interim species that come in that are not as long-lived. So sometimes it's people who are not going to stay with the project forever, but they're really good at getting the project going and keeping it going for the first few years. And then it's time for them to move on. And there are people who come in at that point, like the longer-lived species. But the earlier species has made the ground available and ready for the next wave of activity. And so when you are in a place that doesn't have that particular characteristic, it really does get very hard to even get a project going. And we've had obstacles in some places. If there's political instability, I mean, one of the countries we're in Africa, there's a lot of political instability in that part of the country, and they've still been able to establish a company, have a retail space, get people engaged, get the farmers engaged. So political instability doesn't always mean that we can't get this done. A lot of it is about individual engagement and thoughts about community. That's what I would say. So any country that's a big deal is going to be harder for a model like this to work. Anthea, is there another question that you would like me to direct my attention to in particular?
I see Florentino has a question directly related to Belize. I don't know if you can tackle that. And just a reminder to participants, you have an opportunity this evening to actually interact verbally with Jillian. So please take advantage of that opportunity this evening. You do not have to limit yourselves to the Q&A this evening.
Okay, so the question from Florentina is, have you ever reached out to partner in Belize? Southern Belize, specifically Toledo District, is cacao capital of Belize. You know, the thing is, we did. So early in the formation of ARC, we were given some references in Belize of some community workers who it was thought would be good for us to engage with. But soon after that happened, I think that the people that we were referred to, so we had started being in touch with them, and the people that we were in touch with, something happened in terms of organizational shuffle. And the people that we were in touch with at the time were no longer in a position to guide an action. And so, unfortunately, I think a few things happened, and that was, so let me see if I can remember. I think that was like year 4, and it was about year 5 that we started bringing in a lot more diversity in the Trinidad situation. And so we didn't get back to being able to be in touch with somebody there. It's kind of, it's a little bit interesting. Like, how do we meet people in different places? Sometimes it's a complete coincidence. Somebody sends a message and said, oh, I want you to talk to this person. Does it always work out? No. I mean, we have had some people in some countries. So sometimes it's just like planting. If the soil is not correct in that place, or you spoke to them in the dry season, not the rainy season. I'm just going to use natural analogies because that's how I tend to think of things. It just so happens that things don't line up. Right now, what we're trying to do is prototype the cafe space. I'm just going to move my camera a little bit so you can see the space, but this is a cafe that we have developed, and we are prototyping this model. And so, Cameroon has one now, and we use it. You can follow us on Instagram. It's ARC Co-Create, ARC Co-Create, Alliance of Rural Communities, but ARC Co-Create. And you can see some of the activities that we have here, which are really about promoting people's ability to expand. Sometimes we call it a imagination gym, because obviously what we are thinking about does not exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. So what we need at this point only exists in our imagination. And, that's one reason I read science fiction as a form of a gym for my imagination. And in this space, we have a lot of creative activities. We have conversations that might not have existed before. We have a lot of space for people who are thinking differently. And we are trying to support spaces like this, which we have in East Cleveland, in particular in Memphis, and we are in the process of doing some work like this, as I said, in New York, a project in Harlem, and another project in Bed-Stuy, because imagination is very desperately needed right now. Imagination in the right direction of community well-being. So sometimes things don't line up. But I mean, I'm on this call, so maybe people can reach out and at least we can start with some conversations. And we have prototyped a lot of things. So we have things in tables. We have a toolkit for the cafe, which we're working to expand right now. We have whole systems down. We were able to go to St. Lucia and teach people how to set up a chocolate company in 4 days. It's no different from some of those names I may not call of those franchises that are global. That's how they work. That's how colonialism worked. It used the same education system, the same books, the same geometry set, replication, but that started with nature, right? So a swamp in one place is going to be very similar to a swamp in another place. There may be some differences. Same thing with coral reefs. Nature replicates models with some amount of difference. And that's what you don't see as much in the corporate franchise model. The differences are minimal. And so it's actually leading us towards homogeneity as opposed to flourishing in diversity. I see Stefan has a hand up, and who's the other person? Stefan, if you want to unmute and ask a question, and I think there's one other person. Ramon? Yeah. So Stefan, if you
Yes,
go next and then Ramon.
yes, Miss Goddard. Good night. Thank you for
Good
a
night.
wonderful presentation. Very inspiring, specifically because I'm with a group of people that are gearing up to do and thinking about doing something very similar, but
Mm-hmm.
obviously we're in very early conceptual stages. So
Mm-hmm.
what I'd like to absorb from you is you spoke about in your timeline in the very first stages, you operated without needing any help from anyone by doing training. So I'd like to get into your mind in that early phase, the thought process of how you came up with the training and how you went about gaining momentum to get on the ground to deliver those training, how you transform that momentum to the secondary stages of your development.
Right. Well, Stefan, where are you located?
I'm in Guyana right now,
Okay,
born and
so
bred.
we actually have a Guyanese fledgling enterprise in Guyana. The one of the things that was interesting in Guyana in doing this model is that the distances between the cocoa production and the chocolate market was bigger than any other country we worked in. Of course, since then, we're in Ghana and other places where the distances are also big, but the difference is that in Ghana, they have road transport between where the cocoa is and the markets are, whereas in Ghana, it was boat transport. And so even in getting that to happen, we had to make allowances for things happening in a certain way. And it's really interesting because we kept things a bit small. And then, of course, the situation in Ghana has changed. And so the demand for chocolate has gone up. So the people who learned to make chocolate through our group and got initial equipment, the markets are much more developed. So sometimes there are factors that are unpredictable. So I'm going to go back to your question about how do you start the technical knowledge and understanding? Now, I always tell my son that I believe in magic. And what is magic? It's just the unexplained trajectory of events yet. And at some point, magic becomes science because you understand what happens. But there are certain things that we observed early on, and one of them, in the business world, they call it an MVP, minimum viable product. Before I knew that term, I used to look at my family and I would call it poor people business model, which means you didn't wait to borrow $20,000 or you didn't wait to find a big set of money. If you had a can of condensed milk, you made fudge and you sold that fudge, maybe 5 packs, and then you got the fudge back, the money, and you made 10 fudge. And then you made 20 fudge. Now, I have to say that that model can be a little more difficult to happen now, and that's for multiple reasons. But testing your product as soon as it's at an acceptable level and testing the process that is used to produce that product and documenting everything, like from call this place and see if they have the machines. And okay, you look online. I mean, the richness of the data that's available now compared to when I first started being a bit of a serial explorer like this, 30, 40 years ago, is massive. And so for us, what happened was that we found somebody who had realized that a dal grinder in India could be used to make chocolate, which meant that the entry point was $200 as opposed to the previous colonially boundary chocolate making space where the cheapest machine was $10,000. So sometimes you have to kind of follow where innovation is happening, depending on what your product is. And if you want to talk more about it, we can talk more about the details of it. But I would say the concept of minimum viable product. So you test your market, and through that market, you get data that gives you a direction forward. I would say it's very similar to what the natural world does in terms of a tree is growing and the branch starts to follow where the sunlight seems to be coming from, but then another branch may come on top and then it'll turn direction. And, so there's a certain flow inside of it. Now, when you don't have resources, financial resources. So I'm not saying we did it with none. We did get money from Marshall Montano Foundation for Greatness. We came up with that in order to establish the chocolate company with all the equipment, it was going to cost 2,000 US, and we asked them for the money. We had a relationship with them before because we were making chocolate for them. And we said we wanted a loan. They wanted to give a grant. We said we wanted a loan because we wanted the group. It's a money-making group. So even though they're not going to make a ton of money, having, we put in a commitment that was very loose for how it could be paid back. So it does mean sometimes you got to mobilize resources. Now, of course, as soon as there was evidence that we were getting money, then all of a sudden everybody wants to give you money, right? Not a lot of money, but they become more interested. So the relationship building phase of things that often happens before a project, you have to really make sure that in your group, you have somebody who is interesting, pleasant, and has certain skills. If you start off with a group of people who come across to others as arrogant, I'm not saying they're arrogant, but they come across that way, it gets harder to mobilize the funds or the open space or the market or whatever. But of course, as always, working together is better. So right now, we are trying to do some grant applications that will allow us to support the groups in the network who haven't been able to develop cafes or food trucks or whatever to move forward. But that took a few years to get to that point. I don't know, Stefan, if I answered your question. It's hard. It's just as hard for me to tell you, okay, you got a piece of land and you want to plant it up. I wouldn't be able to tell you how to plant it up if I don't know what's the soil type, how much rain you get every year. So just as with gardening and farming, there are central philosophical themes. You want a diverse space, you want to put down perennial crops as opposed to annual, da 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 da. Those are general principles, but the specifics rely a lot on your particular condition. And that is really hard to answer without getting more information about what the condition is. But definitely relationships and finding ways to mobilize those relationships to get initial resources, making sure you have a product that people are interested in. And all of that you can do by minimum viable product. Test it out. Start making small amounts of it. If your entry point is large and you can't test unless, say, for example, you want to sell a house, that's a very different entry point as opposed to selling bricks or selling workshops for people to learn how to build without commercial materials. So those entry points make a difference. And that's one reason that the sale project has gone much more slowly because I can't just throw a log into the sea and float on it to Grenada and take cocoa butter with me, right? You have to actually have something that needs more resource. And so we are doing other things meanwhile, while we develop relationships. And those relationships last year started coming hard and fast. But because sail cargo is a field of innovation, there has been a contraction, and we expect that there will be another expansion soon, and we'll be able to jump into that expansion. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes, that was the most perfect response. I feel very
Okay,
enlightened right now. Thank you.
good, good. You're welcome. Ramon, you had a question?
Yes, thank you
And where are
for.
you based, Ramon?
Oh, I'm based in Barbados.
Oh, cool.
And thank you very much for your presentation and for also answering one of my prior questions so expertly. You mentioned some work in Rotterdam, and I was wondering if you had the chance to work with or partner with Tony's Chocolate Only, because I know they're a company aiming to create meaningful change in the cocoa industry, especially supply chain wise, or maybe your view on a company like that based in the global north versus operations such as yours in the global south.
Yeah, I am deeply committed to production in the global south. So Tony's Chocolonely is a company, for those of you all who are not in the chocolate world, they have been able to have a really effective marketing campaign. Their marketing campaign has been really effective in getting people to take part of the step towards chocolate as a product with ethics involved. They still do make their chocolate in the global north, but they have their own markers of what is a sustainable price to be paid for a chocolate. In my experience, as somebody who lives in the global south, money is not all that happens when you produce a product. So let me just super quickly try and run through this. So if you sell beans to the global north, cocoa beans, you put them in a sack. The sack is usually imported of jute from, I think it's like the Far East, and you ship out the sack. Yes, there is some level of expertise, lots of different ways you can ferment those beans, dry them, etc. But when you start making chocolate, not only do you have to utilize local electricity, utilize local water, utilize your phone to speak to people, get skills in spreadsheets, receipts, accounts, communication, social media, website, online shopping, going to marketing groups, talking to other farmers, figuring out where the sugar is coming from, getting your driver's license, taking people on tours, therefore learning how to speak effectively in chocolate tours, figuring out how do you match your customer to a product, learning about people inside of retail space, meeting graphic designers, getting somebody to make the label for your chocolate, having a table and a container so you can do pop-ups in different places, participate in farmers markets, pop-up markets, Christmas markets, and so on. Get a vehicle of some sort or pay for a driver to take you to sell your product in a store. I could go on and on and on. I always tell people that if I were to try and get reparations, which I believe in, I could come up with a simple number of what is the difference between the cocoa bean and the chocolate bar for 200 to 300 years. And what else is there attached to it that develops an entire economy by processing on the ground? It is immeasurable. It is uncountable. You cannot see the difference between what I just described as the trajectory of us producing our own goods and getting them to market and all the other things involved. I just touched on a little fraction of the cultural activity and the status that's involved and the development of skills, because people do tell me all the time, why don't you all just send the beans, you set up your own, because there are chocolate models like that. And I have side-by-side comparisons of every model. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And I would not change the trajectory on which I stand, which is we need to be processing, and when I say we, anybody in the world who lives in a raw material producing space, whether it is graphite or water or gravel or corn or sand or whatever, needs to be doing as much production as possible close by and needs to be making relationships with those who eventually use the product. So that's what I would say as my answer. And it's full of passion because the level of damage that has been done to us and that we have accepted as though it's inferiority is unreal. So, this could be a whole other topic of conversation, but hopefully you get a glimpse of why was the model set up, not just in the colonial structure, but in the urban-rural divide, where the rural product entered urban space, and there is where it got processed. So Ramon, hopefully that gives you a little bit of my perspective, not just on Tony Chocolonely, but on the entire Bean to Bar movement in the global north that spends a lot of time talking about paying the farmer properly.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Ashley, I see you have your hand up.
I'm just going to interject here. We're going to take Ashley's question and then we'll have to close the session for tonight because we're just running a bit over time right now. So go ahead, Ashley, and we will close after Ashley.
Hi, good night, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Goddard, for your presentation. So my internet connection has been really bad this evening, so I'm hoping I'm not double asking this question.
That's okay, no problem.
A little more specific about accessing funding. Now, I work with farmers to help them, put in regenerative agriculture type practices into their farm spaces, so to transition away from intensive chemical use. And I was wondering, how do you go about trying to get people mobile when they're in a position where their operations are down to zero and they don't have any funding to be able to restart?
You mean in terms of like, how can you get a farmer? I'm trying to get this specificity. How can you get a farmer to start replanting and to do it with good practices of reduced chemicals and so on when they no longer have any money?
Yes, exactly. So how do you
Right.
who want to do something when they're completely incapable of getting to a starting point?
Well, I mean, I think that's where collectives are super important. I know right now you sound like are you based in Trinidad?
Yes, I am.
Right. So in Trinidad, for those of you all from other islands, there was this and I'm not saying that's what Ashley's talking about, but there was this really large agricultural project that one of the governments put on, and young people went through school for 2 years, and they were told they were going to get land and a house and everything. And, there have been many projects like this in my lifetime, and most of the time they haven't materialized, right? So now, in our network, because chocolate was the first thing, people were ready to cut down their trees. Huh? We had couples who nearly broke up because one of them wanted to cut all the trees down, and the other one, when they heard about chocolate making, they wanted to keep the trees. And there was just bacchanal in the household because of this difference in opinion. Anyhow, so if somebody has land, you're already starting with a base, right? If you don't have land, then your collective skills have to reverse a bit, and you have to find a way to get together with others. Trinidad has very liberal squatting laws. So in general, a lot of our food here is actually produced by people who don't have a firm title to the land. But the land is the first thing. So if they don't have access to land, then that is a place where my suggestion is that people start working on these things when they're in primary school. So we actually have a program in a primary school right now, and hopefully it will lead into a program in high school. By the time you get out of high school, you should be figuring some of these basic needs of life together, including how to grow food. But we're in 2026, that hasn't happened. What that means is that if somebody has no resource, that's not the person that you necessarily, and this may sound harsh, are going to include in the project that where you have to wait for their planting to get to a certain point. Now, if you have short crops, you have to strengthen the soil, whatever. I don't know the particular circumstance, right? But in a case like that, people who have more resource could develop their resource, which is what we did, and then add in the people who have fewer resources to be able to create something that is more resilient and can stand the test of time. So I don't think it's impossible. I do think sometimes you have to reverse or turn direction if there's there's never absolutely no resource. You wouldn't be on the planet or alive or whatever if you had no resource. But financial resource, that's depending on every particular situation. We have been able to mobilize resource in many different ways. There are agricultural support organizations, there are collective farming groups, there are groups that people maybe like a community that is together for faith reasons. Some of those groups are where people have had resources to be able to get started. Maybe if you're open to it, you could reach out to me through that same Instagram page, and we could sit down and talk in a more specific way, because we have a large group of farmers, right? And we've been farming collectively. Someone squatted land, someone purchased land, someone family land, and doing things together. There's a project starting in Matura. There's a guy up in Matura this weekend. Collective work. We did a collective farming bed in St. Augustine last week. And so making sure that the farmers groups are organized and ensuring that they are continually working to expand the group, especially regenerative farming. Everybody in our group is an organic farmer. I have never used chemicals. I wouldn't even know how to use them, purchased chemicals or outside chemicals. And so reach out to us and let's talk.
Thank you, Jillian. What I'm specifically looking at, and I could reach out to you, yes, for us to talk about it more, is I'm looking at trying to help an estate of about 50 something farmers who are mostly not farming because of the fact that climate conditions have made it too hard for them to do agriculture outside of the rainy season. And even with the rainy season incoming and how climate change is affecting our rainfall patterns, it's so spotty that they also see more problems. So most of them are actually fairly close to the poverty line, and so they don't have the ability to do much in terms of their own individual resources. So I've been trying to help them get to a place of approaching regenerative agriculture to try to limit some of those issues that they're facing. The problem with that, however, is trying to get the funding or trying to find a way to get the funding, considering they're a fairly newly formed CSO in terms of their body, and they don't have a lot of experience just yet.
Right.
As farmers.
Right. And that's not an uncommon scenario, definitely in Trinidad and in some of the other islands. And so that definitely requires a sit down to go through it. Just off the top of my head, I mean, we exchange a lot of germplasm, we trade seedlings, we trade information. During COVID, our farming groups really flourished, our organic farming groups. So we used to do what's called a GYBN. It's an indigenous word for land hand in Trinidad. And so we would go and work on each other's land. Most islands have similar systems set up, cultural land hand, self-help systems. And that's one of the ways that we were able to support each other. And if this is a group that doesn't have a lot of information about regenerative farming, then it's a very specific task and direction and design of project that you have to do to make something like that work. So that's not something that I can give a quick fix, but I would say that always collective work is best. And so, give us a shout. Auntie, I know we're at the end of time. So
Yes, thank you so much, Jillian, for stepping in this evening and speaking with our participants. I know that they would have appreciated the interaction tonight in particular, and hopefully the discussion inspires them to take action in their communities and support local food projects or even reach out to grassroots organizations in their communities to offer support. And guys, yes, Jillian has given you the okay to reach out to her for more information. So the conversation does not end tonight in this webinar. So please do reach out and we will be sure to post the recording as soon as it becomes available. Thank you so much again, Jillian, and good night, everybody.
yeah, and thank you so much for having me here and inviting me into your homes, which probably is homes at this hour, all across the region. I love the Caribbean, and I think we have so much ability to have an exciting group of supply chains that we develop here. So thank you and good night. And hopefully, Auntie, I can see those questions after and maybe put some answers that you all can circulate in the group.
Yes, definitely. We will make note of all the questions and share with you. And, once you're available, we'd be so grateful if you can offer responses to the participants.
Yes, lots of interesting questions I'm seeing here that I would
Yeah,
really
thank
like to answer. Take care and good night.
Good night, everybody.